At the edge of a rain-soaked valley, where the Cascade foothills met endless stands of Douglas fir, a Norwegian widow was still working on her cabin roof in late October while her neighbors had sealed theirs weeks before. They called her the rain catcher. They called her touched in the head. While everyone else raised peaked roofs with 812 pitches designed to shed water as fast as it fell, she was building something no one in the valley had ever seen, a roof that sloped inward, two planes meeting at a central trough like a shallow V turned upside down. Her neighbors gathered at the edge of her clearing to watch what they were certain would be a disaster in the making. The local sawmill owner, a man named Garrett, who had built half the cabins in the settlement, said she was building a bathtub on top of her house. The other homesteaders' wives whispered that grief had broken something inside her, that losing her husband to the fever last spring had left her unable to think straight. They couldn't understand why any sensible woman would design a roof to hold water when the whole point of a roof was to get rid of it. In this country, where rain fell for 9 months of the year and moss grew on anything that stood still, fighting water was the only battle that mattered. But that fool woman's roof, the one that caught rain instead of shedding it, it would stand dry for 30 years while her neighbors patched and cursed and replaced theirs every decade. What did she understand about water management, structural load, and the principles of controlled drainage that made her upside-down design the difference between endless repairs and 3 decades without a single leak? The widow's name was Sigrid Holmgren. She had come to the Oregon Territory with her husband Eric in the spring of 1889, drawn by the promise of timber claims and rich soil in a land that received more rainfall in a single month than their native Bergen saw in an entire summer. Eric had been a shipwright in the old country, a man who understood how water moved across surfaces and what happened when you tried to fight it rather than guide it. He had spent 20 years building vessels that kept the North Sea out, and he knew that water was patient in ways that wood and tar and human effort could never match. Water found every weakness. Water exploited every gap. The only defense was to give water a path it preferred, a route so easy and obvious that it never bothered looking for alternatives. He had taught Sigrid to think about water the way a river pilot thinks about current, not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a force to be directed. During their first winter in the territory, huddled in a temporary shelter while rain drummed on the canvas roof above, he had sketched designs by lantern light and explained principles that went back centuries. The best builders, he said, were the ones who stopped fighting and started cooperating. When the fever took him, it took everything except the knowledge he had shared during 2 years of building together. And that knowledge lived in Sigrid's hands now, in the way she measured and cut, in the understanding of pitch and drainage, and the places where water liked to collect and rot. She had buried him on the hillside above the clearing where their permanent cabin would stand, and she had made him a promise that she intended to keep. Her neighbors were building fast and building standard. The common approach throughout the territory was a simple gable roof, 2 sloped planes meeting at a central ridge, with the peak running the length of the cabin and the eaves extending just far enough to keep rain off the walls. These roofs went up quick, using 2-6 rafters at 24-inch centers, with 1-8 sheathing covered in split cedar shakes. The pitch ran steep, usually 812 or steeper, designed on the theory that the faster water left the roof, the less chance it had to find its way inside. The theory was sound. The execution was the problem. Those peaked roofs had 2 valleys where the water concentrated. The eaves on either side, where runoff poured off the edge in sheets during heavy rain. The water hit the ground and splashed back against the foundation logs, wicking moisture into the wood and starting the slow process of rot that would eventually undermine every structure in the valley. Worse, the peaked design created a ridgeline at the very top of the roof, a seam running the full length of the cabin where two planes of shakes met at an angle. No matter how carefully a builder fitted that ridge, no matter how much tar and moss he packed into the joint, water found its way through. The ridge was the weak point. And in a country where rain fell sideways as often as it fell straight down, where wind-driven moisture could force itself into gaps that seemed too small to matter, that weak point became the source of endless leaks. Every cabin in the valley leaked at the ridge. Every spring, when the rains came hard and the wind blew from the southwest, homesteaders climbed onto their roofs with buckets of hot tar and armfuls of cedar bark, patching the same seams they had patched the year before. The cycle never ended. The ridge always leaked, and the families below learned to position their beds and tables and cook stoves away from the spots where the drips fell worst. Sigrid had watched this cycle through 2 rainy seasons. She had helped Eric patch their own ridge 3 times before the fever came, and she had listened to him talk about a different approach, a design he had seen in the shipyards of Bergen, used on certain flat-roofed warehouses where the builders had solved the problem by eliminating the ridge entirely. Instead of 2 planes meeting at a peak, the warehouse roofs featured 2 planes sloping inward toward a central trough. The water didn't race toward the edges. It collected in the middle, where a carefully constructed channel directed it to a single downspout at one end of the building. There was no ridge to leak. There were no eaves pouring water against the foundation. There was only the trough, lined with copper or lead, directing every drop of rain exactly where the builders wanted it to go. Eric had sketched the design in his journal. Sigrid found those sketches 3 weeks after the burial, tucked between pages of notes about timber species and soil drainage. Looking at them, she understood what he had been planning for their permanent cabin, the one they would build once the proving period ended and the land was truly theirs. She would build it without him. She would build it his way. The foundation work began in early September, following the same approach every homesteader used. Cedar logs laid on flat stones, notched at the corners and chinked with moss and clay. The cabin measured 16 by 20 feet, larger than most in the valley, with a ceiling height of 8 feet to allow for the unusual roof structure above. Sigrid worked alone for the walls, cutting and fitting logs that were lighter than pine, but still demanded more strength than most women possessed. Her neighbors watched, but did not offer help. They had decided she was building foolishness, and helping foolishness only encouraged more of the same. By the first week of October, the walls stood complete. 4 courses of Douglas fir logs, each one hand-peeled and notched with the saddle joints Eric had taught her, rose solid and true against the gray autumn sky. The windows, 2 on the south wall, 1 on the east, were framed and ready for the oiled paper that would cover them until she could afford glass. The door hung plumb in its frame, fitted tight enough to block the drafts that plagued her neighbors' cabins. But it was the roof that drew the crowds. Sigrid began by constructing a central beam that ran the full 20-foot length of the cabin, supported at each end by posts that rose from the wall plates and braced at the midpoint by a 3rd post anchored to a floor joist below. This beam sat 6 inches lower than the wall plates on either side, the key measurement that would create the inward slope. From the wall plates, rafters extended inward and downward at a 3/12 pitch, meeting the central beam to form a shallow V that ran the length of the structure. The sawmill owner came on the second day of roof construction, arms crossed, shaking his head at what he saw. "That beam is your ridge," he said. "You've put it at the bottom instead of the top. Every drop of rain that hits this roof will run straight to the center and sit there until it rots through." Sigrid didn't stop working. She had learned from Eric that arguing with men who thought they knew everything was a waste of breath better spent on labor. "The trough," she said, "and nothing more." Garrett watched as she began constructing the central channel, a V-shaped gutter built from 108 boards, lined with layer upon layer of pine pitch and canvas, sealed at every joint with a mixture of tar and sawdust that Eric had developed during his shipwright years. The trough was 8 inches deep and 12 inches wide at the top, narrowing to 6 inches at the bottom, sized to handle the heaviest rainfall the valley had ever recorded. At the north end of the cabin, the trough extended 18 inches past the wall, terminating in a carved wooden spout that would direct water into a cedar barrel positioned below. At the south end, a smaller overflow spout provided backup drainage in case the primary channel couldn't handle the volume. "You're building a gutter on top of your house," Garrett said. "That's the craziest thing I ever saw." Sigrid kept working. The pitch and canvas lining went down in layers, each one pressed flat and sealed to the one below, creating a waterproof membrane that would flex with the wood's seasonal movement without cracking or separating. Over the trough went a series of cedar slats, spaced 1/2 inch apart, designed to catch leaves and debris before they could clog the channel below. The sheathing went up next, 1x6 boards running from the wall plates down to the central beam, creating 2 sloped planes that would direct every drop of water toward the trough. Unlike her neighbors' roofs, where the sheathing ran parallel to the ridge, Sigrid's sheathing ran perpendicular to the slope, providing more structural support and creating natural channels that would guide water toward the center. The shakes came last. Split cedar, each one 18 inches long and 6 inches wide at the butt end, laid in overlapping courses with 6-inch exposure. The courses ran horizontal, parallel to the wall plates, with each shake offset from the one below to create a staggered pattern that would block water from finding a straight path through the layers. At the central trough, the shakes from both planes overlapped the gutter by 2 inches, preventing direct rainfall from hitting the channel while still allowing runoff to flow freely into it. The overhang was the crucial detail. Too little, and rain would drive straight into the gutter, overwhelming the drainage. Too much and debris would accumulate in the gap between shakes and trough, creating dams that would back water up under the roofing. By the 3rd week of October, the roof was complete. Sigrid stood in her clearing, looking up at the structure that had consumed 6 weeks of labor and every dollar Eric had left her. The roofline was unmistakable, a broad V sinking toward the center, the opposite of every cabin in the valley. Where other roofs rose proudly to their peaks, hers settled into its center like a hammock slung between 2 trees. The visual effect was strange, almost unsettling, a house that looked like it was already beginning to collapse before it had finished being built. The neighbors came by in small groups, pointing and shaking their heads. Some laughed openly. Others simply stared with the quiet pity reserved for those who had clearly lost their way. A delegation of women from the settlement brought her a pot of stew and an offer to help her tear off the roof and rebuild it properly before the rains came. They meant well. They genuinely believed she had made a terrible mistake and would suffer for it through the coming winter. Sigrid thanked them for the stew. She declined the offer. The rains came 3 days later. The first storm blew in from the southwest on a Thursday evening, bringing 2 inches of rain in 6 hours and wind gusts that shook the fir trees like stalks of wheat. Sigrid sat inside her cabin, listening to the water moving across her roof, not the scattered drumming of drops on a peaked surface, but a continuous rushing sound as sheets of rain slid down both plains and merged in the central trough. She had placed a lantern near the ceiling, watching for the drips that appeared in every cabin during the first storms of the season. The light revealed nothing but dry planks and tight joints. Outside, she could hear the water pouring from the spout into the barrel she had positioned below, a steady stream that filled the 40-gallon container in less than 2 hours. The next morning, Garrett came by with 2 other homesteaders, all of them expecting to find a flooded cabin and a woman ready to admit her mistake. They found Sigrid splitting kindling on her covered porch, dry as Sunday morning. "We came to help you patch," Garrett said, looking up at the strange roof with obvious confusion. "Where's it leaking?" "It isn't," Sigrid said. They didn't believe her. They went inside, examined every inch of the ceiling, ran their hands along the central beam where the trough sat hidden above the planking. Everything was dry. Not damp, not slightly moist, not showing the dark spots that indicated water finding its way through. Completely, perfectly dry. "That's not possible," one of the homesteaders said. "It rained 2 inches last night. My ridge is leaking in 3 places." Sigrid shrugged and kept splitting kindling. The second storm came a week later, dropping 4 inches in 18 hours. 3 cabins in the valley developed serious leaks, water streaming down interior walls, pooling on floors, soaking bedding and stores. The homesteaders spent the following week on their roofs, patching and cursing, while the rain continued to fall. Sigrid's cabin stayed dry. By December, the pattern was undeniable. Every peaked roof in the valley had leaked at least once. Some had leaked repeatedly, requiring multiple patches and ongoing attention. The ridge seams that had seemed so tight in September had worked loose under the constant assault of rain and wind, opening gaps that would only widen as the seasons progressed. The upside-down roof had no ridge seam. There was nothing to work loose, no joint at the highest point where water pressure could force itself through. The water went where Sigrid told it to go, down the slopes, into the trough, out the spout, into the barrel. Every drop, every time, exactly as planned. The first winter taught the valley about drainage. The second winter taught them about maintenance. By February of the first year, every homesteader in the valley had climbed onto their roof at least twice to make repairs. The peaked designs required constant attention. Shakes worked loose in the wind. Ridge seams opened under the freeze-thaw cycle. Moss grew in the joints and held moisture against the wood. A conscientious homesteader could expect to spend 20 to 30 hours per year on roof maintenance, plus the cost of materials for patching and replacement. Sigrid spent 4 hours that winter on her roof, and most of that time was devoted to clearing the debris screens above the central trough. The screens caught leaves and fir needles before they could enter the drainage channel, and cleaning them twice during the rainy season kept the system flowing freely. The trough itself required no maintenance. The pitch and canvas lining remained watertight, and the gentle slope ensured that standing water never accumulated long enough to cause problems. The water barrel at the north end of the cabin filled and refilled throughout the rainy season, providing Sigrid with more fresh water than she could use. While her neighbors hauled buckets from the creek a quarter-mile away, she simply walked to her back door and filled her pot from the barrel that the roof kept topped up. It was an unexpected benefit, one that Eric had mentioned in his sketches, but that Sigrid hadn't fully appreciated until she experienced it firsthand. The roof wasn't just keeping water out, It was capturing water she could use. The same principle that protected her ceiling was filling her wash basin. By the 5th year, the difference in structural condition was visible to anyone who cared to look. The peaked roofs were showing their age, shakes curling and splitting, ridgelines sagging slightly, where the constant moisture had begun to weaken the underlying structure. 2 cabins had required complete re-roofing, an expensive and labor-intensive process that consumed weeks of work and significant amounts of money. Sigrid's roof looked almost exactly as it had the day she finished it. The cedar shakes had weathered to a silver gray, but they lay flat and tight against the sheathing beneath. The central trough, inspected each spring when she cleaned the debris screens, showed no signs of deterioration. By the 10th year, Garrett finally asked her to teach him. He stood in her clearing on a spring morning, hat in his hands, looking up at the roof he had mocked a decade earlier. His own cabin had been re-roofed twice, and he was facing the prospect of a 3rd replacement within the next few years. "I was wrong," he said. "Whatever you're doing up there, it works. I want to know how." Sigrid brought out Eric's journal. The sketches were faded now, the paper soft with handling, but the principles were still clear. She explained the central trough, how it eliminated the ridge seam that caused most leaks, how it collected water in a controlled location rather than shedding it in sheets from the eaves. She explained the pitch and canvas lining, how the layered approach created redundancy, how the flexibility of the materials accommodated wood movement without cracking. She explained the debris screens and the overflow spout and the precise measurements that made the difference between a system that worked and one that failed. She showed him the journal, page by page, translating Eric's Norwegian notes into principles that Garrett could apply. The central trough, she explained, needed to be sized for the worst rain you could imagine, and then sized a bit larger for the rain you couldn't. The pitch of the slopes mattered less than the pitch of the trough itself. A shallow slope on the roof planes was acceptable, even desirable, because it slowed the water and reduced the force hitting the central channel. But the trough needed at least a 2% grade toward the drainage spout, enough to keep water moving even when debris accumulated. The lining was crucial. Canvas alone would rot. Pitch alone would crack. But canvas saturated in pitch, applied in multiple layers with each layer pressed flat before the next went down, created a membrane that was both waterproof and flexible. It could stretch with the wood's seasonal expansion and contraction without pulling away from the joints. "It's not magic," she said. "It's just thinking about where the water wants to go and building the roof to match." Garrett built his next cabin with a butterfly roof. So did 3 other homesteaders who had grown tired of patching their ridges every season. Within 15 years, a quarter of the new construction in the valley followed Sigrid's design. Not everyone converted. The peaked roof was traditional, familiar, the way things had always been done. Some homesteaders couldn't accept that a woman, a foreign widow working alone, had figured out something their fathers and grandfathers had missed. They kept building their gable roofs and kept patching their ridge seams and kept complaining about the endless Oregon rain. But those who paid attention, those who valued results over tradition, learned what Sigrid had known from the beginning. Water wasn't an enemy to be fought. It was a force to be directed. And a roof that worked with water's natural behavior would outperform one that worked against it year after year, decade after decade. Sigrid lived in her cabin for 31 years. When she died in the winter of 1922, the roof above her had never leaked. Not once. Not a single drip in 31 years of Oregon rain. Her neighbors' children, who had grown up watching their parents patch and curse and replace their peaked roofs, inherited cabins that required constant maintenance. Sigrid's niece, who came from Bergen to settle the estate, inherited a structure that needed nothing more than a fresh coat of whitewash on the interior walls. The central trough was still watertight. The pitch and canvas lining, inspected for the first time in a decade, showed no signs of deterioration. The cedar shakes, now 31 years old, had weathered to the color of old silver, but remained solid and functional. The sawmill had long since closed, and Garrett had been dead for 15 years. But his son, who had taken over the family timber claim, still remembered the day his father came home talking about the crazy Norwegian woman and her upside-down roof. She wasn't crazy, the son told his own children. She just knew something the rest of us were too stubborn to learn. The principles Sigrid applied in 1891 are still valid today. Modern architects call it a butterfly roof or an inverted V roof, and engineers have refined the details with contemporary materials and drainage systems. But the core insight remains unchanged. A roof without a ridge seam has no ridge seam to leak, and a controlled drainage system outperforms uncontrolled runoff. In regions with heavy rainfall, butterfly roofs have proven to last 40 to 50% longer than traditional peaked designs, primarily because they eliminate the ridgeline weakness that causes most structural failures. The central trough, when properly constructed and maintained, provides decades of leak-free performance. The water collection capability that Sigrid's neighbors considered absurd has become a valued feature in modern sustainable design. A butterfly roof on a typical residential structure can capture 80 to 90% of rainfall for storage and reuse, compared to the scattered runoff from a peaked design. But perhaps the most important lesson from Sigrid's cabin isn't technical at all. It's the willingness to question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, to look at a problem from a different angle and ask whether the traditional solution is really the best one. Her neighbors assumed that a roof should shed water as quickly as possible. Sigrid asked what would happen if she slowed the water down and directed it instead. Her neighbors assumed that a ridge was necessary for structural stability. Sigrid asked what would happen if she put the lowest point in the middle instead of the highest. They thought she was crazy. She was just thinking clearly about a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. The rain still falls in the Oregon valleys, just as it did in 1891. The peaked roofs still leak at their ridges, just as they always have. And somewhere in the Historical Society archives, there's a sketch in a faded journal showing a roof that slopes the wrong way, a design that worked perfectly for 31 years, while the neighbors mocked and patched and wondered why their own roofs kept letting the water in. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But the water knows. The water always knows, and it goes where you tell it to go, or it goes where it wants to, straight through your ceiling and onto everything you own. Sigrid told it where to go, and for 31 years it listened.